a dream that we'd all die for, a reason for us all to live and something we could fight for. I might just help a man up to his feet or hold a newborn, but no matter what I do, my hands remembering my rifle.
Welcome to Veteran State of Mind. I'm your host, Garrett Jones. We have a fantastic guest for you today. But before we get into it, I just want to say massive thank you to our sponsors, which are a lot of you, the listeners, who are contributing to the Patreon for the podcast. We really appreciate it. For as little as £1 a month, you can sponsor a child, and that child is me, Garrett Jones. And the podcast helps us cover the recording costs and all that kind of stuff. Also want to say a massive thank you to Combat Fuel. If you are in the forces, you can use their products with full confidence. It's all within the informed sports regulations, all that kind of thing. I use the products myself. Whey protein, I use actually I shouldn't tell you what I use because then it'll go out of stock. But I can't do that to you. White chocolate, whey protein is my favorite. And then if you want something a little bit different, check out their clear proteins. I don't know what kind of hocus pocus they use to make these things, but it's almost like having a juice drink, but it's protein. Check it out yourself. You won't be disappointed. They've got pre-workouts. They've got all kinds of supplements for your joints, sleep aids, all that kind of thing. Combat Fuel. Check them out. Link down in the show notes. And also want to say a massive thank you to Zulu Alpha Strap Company. Veteran-owned, veteran-operated. Great, swearing there, I'm not going to swear to them, we're professional. A great team down there, run by Daz. I've been supporting the podcast for a long time. If you've got a nice watch, get yourself a nice strap for it. And if you haven't got a nice watch, why don't you start your way up to one with a Zulu Alpha strap? And I should have said as well, Patreon, if you're interested in having a look and joining up, you can do so down in the show notes. Really appreciate you guys getting behind that because it is, it gives me kind of like a lot of, kind of confidence that we're giving you what you want if you're willing to put your hand in your pocket and support the podcast. If everyone chucks in £1, we can bring the podcast to you on a regular basis. And people do ask about video and stuff as well. I'd love to start doing the video podcast, but we need some more Patreons for that. So check them out. Right, guys, without further ado, let me introduce you to today's guest. She is a writer, a war reporter, adventurer, author, speaker, and ambassador for the Burnt Children Relief charity and also Emergency USA. I'll put all of Hollie's stuff. She's up to so much stuff. I really recommend her Substack as well, which is she has dispatches in there from around the world. A lot of war zones in there. Hollie's been in Iraq, covering everything with ISIS. She's been in Afghanistan a lot. We're going to be talking a lot about Afghanistan today, but she's been all over the place. She's a great writer and just goes to these really interesting places. And what I really like about her writing is it's not the it's none of this fluffy stuff that you'll get from the news channel. She's getting in there, talking to the people, talking to the people that war really affects. So I really admire her for that, and I really enjoyed today's conversation. I know you will too. So without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Hollie McKay. Hollie, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for giving up your time.
Thank you for having me.
We have so many directions that we could go into with this, with your career, your experiences. We're gonna kind of concentrate on Afghanistan a little bit today, and I don't think we can really go down the Afghanistan route without knowing your kind of, let's call it the 9/11 moment. That moment that everyone's like, I think every veteran who was there in the early days remembers it. The crazy thing is, a lot of veterans who were there last year weren't even born when 9/11 happened, so they don't have their 9/11 moment, which kind of blows my mind. But where were you? Where was it? Where did it all happen? And where did the Afghanistan journey begin for you?
Gosh, I was at boarding school in Sydney in Australia when 9/11 happened. I think I was 15, almost 16. And, living in a very sort of sheltered bubble. I grew up in North Queensland on a sugarcane farm, really. And then I went to a ballet boarding school and was sort of training to be a professional ballerina. So 9/11 was sort of very left of field. I didn't have a deep understanding of geopolitics. Afghanistan wasn't really a place that I'd even heard of at that point. But it certainly, I think, was a moment for me in realizing how little I knew about the world, how little we're taught at school about the world, and that just this entire history that I absolutely had no idea about. But I think at that point, it certainly piqued an interest, but I could never have imagined the role that Afghanistan would then play in my life in the decades to come. So that sort of is was sort of the crazy part. And when I was in Afghanistan last year and it was the 20-year anniversary for 9/11, I remember sort of sitting there thinking, wow, you could just never have told me how much Afghanistan would mean to me, at that point in time. So it's been a long journey.
So what were those kind of stepping stones then from getting you from boarding school, ballet class to Afghanistan? Because you, I don't think you were in the military, were you? Which is obviously the career that kind of takes most people there by choice or not. So what was it that kind of led you down that path?
So I always thought I would go into, I always loved to write, but I really, my love in life was my ballet. And it was something I'd been doing since I was very young. And I thought that was, what I was going to do. And I broke my ankle when I was 18. So that sort of rendered me to go back to university for a little bit. I really hated that sort of school life. I hated being in these sort of classrooms with people lecturing at me. And I think I wanted to be out in the field, so to speak. I ended up getting a sort of a scholarship, exchange scholarship to go and study in New York to do my last semester. And so I think I was about 20 and I went to New York and people were talking about these internships and I really didn't understand. We just don't have those in Australia. You're either working or you're doing work experience or you're studying. So I just made a few calls. I'd had a bit of a experience in coding on the web. And so this was sort of the 2006 beginning of the digital boom. And I ended up getting an internship with Fox News in New York. And at the end of that, they offered to sponsor me. And so I was sort of in this dilemma of, do I want to go down a news path, which is something I hadn't really considered before, or do I want to continue to pursue my dancing career? But I think that opportunity to be sponsored and to go to Los Angeles, and that was just really too much to sort of say no to at that point. So I started my career really in LA. It was very general assignment. So one minute you might be at the Oscars, next minute I'd be at the Compton courthouse covering a Suge Knight trial. In another instant, I'd be on some political investigation somewhere. So it was this very big baptism by fire. But really at that point, you're looking at when the surges started in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I also felt there was this whole part of the world that I really wanted to understand that was very much outside my Los Angeles sphere. And so I'd had a little bit of a background speaking very rudimentary Arabic. So I sort of used that as leverage to get to the Middle East. And then eventually that also led me to Afghanistan. And I think my first experiences in covering conflicts and just visiting places in the world that just seemed so far away from me, it was a sort of a love at first sight. And when I first started to do it, I just couldn't imagine doing anything else. And everything that I came back, when I would come back to the States and try to be again, going to the Grammys or on a red carpet somewhere, it felt just so removed from the work that I wanted to be doing. And so I really sort of took that leap and took charge of what I wanted to do and basically manipulated my bosses into to sending me into wild places that no one really wanted to go to. So that's how I got my foot in. It was nobody came to me and said, "Here, we want you to go here." It was very much me push each time. It was a slug, but I was very determined that there was just so many fascinating stories that needed to be told.
Where did that writing spark come from in you?
I loved to write always. I think as a kid, I remember my mum was studying early childhood at university when I was young. So I was sort of her test case. So I would often write books for her. And so I always had a fairly wild imagination, and writing was something I always loved, but I never really understood that it could be a career. I just thought it was something you did for fun. You read, you write. That was all a fun way to really use our imagination. And it really wasn't till I got my foot into journalism that I understood that this was something that could be a career. And I think for me, I had such a deep love for writing, and I loved it a lot more than I ever loved doing anything on camera, because to me, even though, everybody wanted to sort of be in front of the camera, and that seemed like the most lucrative path, and, it certainly is a more lucrative path than being a writer, but there was something about being able to, for example, to just be able to sit with a subject somewhere, and you're sitting with them, and you're sitting with them for hours, and you're with their family, and you're spending days, if not weeks, with them to write a piece. And that's something that can't really quite be translated, on camera or in a quick, 5-minute segment even. And so for me, it was really about getting the detail and the depth. And that was why I really wanted to go into that long form writing, because I really felt that was the way that you could get to know a place and a subject and a culture in a much more intimate way.
What were the kind of books that you were reading then, kind of, growing up? Were you into war journalism then?
I think, and one book that really sticks out for me is To Carve Her Name with Pride. And it was a book by R.J. Minnie. I think I read it when I was about 13 or 14. It was this really old book that I found in the back of my school library. And it was basically about a British French woman who served as an underground spy during the Second World War. And, it was incredible because it was just so eye-opening, her tenacity. And she was eventually captured by the Germans really just before the war ended. And her tenacity in not giving up any information and to really sticking to her guns and to just being this real trailblazer. That was something that had a deep impact on me, because I thought of all these, incredible people whose names we do know, her now, but all these people that served in a way that we'll never know their names and we'll never know their stories. And that captivated me, not necessarily because I wanted to go down that route myself, but because I felt these stories had such an impact on me, how many more of them were out there. And they were certainly stories I was really intrigued by and wanted to tell in many ways. And my grandfather, who I never met, was a World War II veteran, and he served in Papua New Guinea, and everything was very mysterious to me. And my nana would just tell me stories sort of about how when she met him after the war and his struggles with alcoholism, he ended up dying of alcohol poisoning, I think, when he was very young, about 40. And so it really also was just an intriguing thing for me to understand the impact of war as well, because it's something, especially at that point, that really still wasn't talked about a great deal. So there were just little pieces of the pie, I think, throughout my childhood and growing up that sort of formed that interest and that curiosity.
So what I was just thinking as well, like you were talking about library books there, and I was just thinking about that, because I mean, I forget really about kind of reading in childhood and finding books in the library and what kind of joy there was when you came across something that you found you'd find in. I don't know. I just don't feel like it's an experience that people have as much finding books online as like when you're going through. Yeah. I guess you could have it in charity shops and stuff. You digging through bins or whatever of books, and then you just come across some real gem that you'd never have. You never would have known that person's story, and then you just get this crazy like echo from history, and it feels so. Like I think a lot of these smaller books, which they're not as well known, you feel like you have this really intimate connection with the writer, because that there's probably only a few thousand people left in the world now that might know this person's story, maybe less than that. And I think that's, I've always been into that kind of connection. Were you somebody that used to steal books from the school library?
Oh, I'm sure there's probably like an arrest warrant out for me somewhere along the line of things not returned. But wasn't it? It was so cool. I can remember the smell, and like you pick up those old books and using the card, and it was something special. I think that is kind of lost now, that we just don't have it anymore.
Do you ever go to the library, like a physical library?
No, I don't. It was funny. I went to a national library conference with a publisher friend of mine a couple of months ago, and all these people from all over, really the world, were there. And I remember her and I having this discussion about, wow, there are still these libraries that exist, because, do you know anyone that goes to a library still? And we're sort of like, no, we don't. It's even hard to kind of find a bookstore anymore. So it's certainly a dying breed, but yeah, it was in some ways encouraging to still see so many people that were there, on behalf of different libraries around the world.
I mean, you might have seen these yourself. I'm sure you'd have over there. One of the things that I thought was really cool in certain parts of LA is you get these, like these little libraries on the street where people have got, it's almost like a big birdhouse or whatever, you know, it's got the door on the front, and they just ask you to kind of like, you take one book out and drop one book in or whatever, and you can just walk down the street and take it, which I always feel really weird doing in America, because I know they can shoot you for a lot of stuff with with taking property. So I'm always a bit wondering if it's a trap or whatever. But I think it's really cool when you see things like that around, because there's just something special about having a physical book, I think, right?
Yeah, there is. But I have to say, I have in recent times really embraced the Kindle. I never thought that I would. Being on the road so much, I don't want to accumulate things. So I sort of went through this whole minimalism thing. So I forced myself to download books on Kindle, which is great if you're on a plane or on a long road trip. And what I love about it is you can go through and highlight passages that you love and just immediately pull them up. And for me, when I'm reading, I think these days it's often about more about I'm looking for really quality writing that can inspire me even more so than the actual content of the book itself. So when I find those passages that you're just like, oh my gosh, this is just so incredibly written, and being able to highlight them, and whenever I'm in my writer's rut, I can just kind of flick it open and immediately go back to it and get that sort of sense of inspiration. So I'm adapting slowly.
I do the same kind of thing. Like I just had, I don't know if you ever heard of Bernard Cornwell. He wrote like the Sharp books, and he's just massively successful historical fiction author. And I might just for like one night just read 2 chapters of one of his books, and then I put it back on the shelf because I'm not interested in going through the whole story. But just like that kind of masterful, you know, like it's just art, this brilliant art for 2 chapters, and then I'm like you said, I'm like, right, I'm inspired now. Book down, and I'm not going to go. Yeah, I'm not going to see the rest of the story. You've got a book coming out, and we're going to talk a bit more about that later. And I want to talk a little bit more about writing later on. But let's go back to Afghanistan. First time you went out there, how the hell did you arrange just going out to Afghanistan? So like how does a journalist kind of go about that? Is this something that you was done through Fox, or is this something you had to kind of figure everything out off your own back?
Yeah, even, with my work with Fox, I still pretty much, I did everything. Always did my own logistics, worked out my own storylines, coordinated my own fixes. Like I pretty much did it all. So the first trip I did was I just came back. I spent most of my sort of career in Iraq and the Middle East. And so I went, I believe it was the beginning of 2017, and I spent a few months out there then. And yeah, I mean, I had a friend who'd done some work in Kabul and was able to introduce me to an incredible fixer. His name was Muslim, and he had been one of the Panjshiri fighters and a guard for Massoud back during the Soviet war. And so he had this very rich sort of experience of Afghanistan. And so I kind of went and met with him. I think I met him in Dubai, and we had a big chat, and then basically got on a plane and went to Kabul. And that was sort of the beginning of the spring offensive. So it was a fairly heavy time in terms of fighting. And it was just as the US had dropped that giant Moab bomb. So that was sort of my quest, was to figure out how I was going to get myself to this Taliban ISIS territory of Jalalabad and do a story on what the aftermath of that was, and get in there. And then sort of in the process, you just learn so much along the way, whether it's you're talking to women, you're talking to soldiers. I remember going to interview some of the captured Taliban fighters, and their stories were just incredible. So really, it was just trying to find the right people. And sort of an approach that I take, I think, is you use that one person's story to sort of paint that larger picture. So rather than throwing out a whole bunch of numbers and statistics, which are meaningful, but they tend to sanitize a conflict or remove us from the battlefield in many ways. But when you're really up close with people from all sides of the spectrum, and you're able to tell that individual story, I think that gives people a much broader sense of exactly what is going on. So that was really sort of my intention there. And I remember, it was a bizarre time, because we didn't really know at that point what was happening. There was still, early peace talks, but yet there seemed to just be daily bombings that were happening across the city, it was really hard to travel to places that weren't in the city. So we were restricted in that way, and so that was certainly a contrast to everything that happened later. But I fell very deeply in love with Afghanistan because I really saw it as a somewhat of a forgotten war. I saw how US and NATO troops, had worked to really try to bring some incredible programs into Afghanistan. But yet you were looking at a security situation which was just so incredibly fragile at the time. It was hard to imagine that was ever going to end. And so I think it's easy to sort of walk away from Afghanistan, and particularly then there just seemed to be little interest in it. But I was determined to somehow continue to keep going back and telling the stories.
So you mentioned you came from Iraq and you were there. You saw a lot of what was going on with ISIS and that kind of whole situation there. What were some of the kind of striking differences that you found in the one conflict to the other?
I think you're looking, with Iraq and ISIS, it was so much of it was urban fighting. ISIS had just come in and taken over. I believe it was at least a third of Iraq at that point. And also huge parts of Syria. So you're looking at just these incredible, Mosul being under control, Raqqa being under ISIS control. And so you're just looking at this really incredible sort of door-to-door fighting and the incredible sort of logistics that had to go into it. And then when it was all said and done, completely flattened cities. And to me, you're looking at this is what a victory looks like, a city that's entirely flattened. For me, that was really hard for me to get my head around. Contrast that with Afghanistan, it's a lot more fighting in very rural places. So you didn't have sort of mass destruction of cities, but yet it seemed to be certainly less, there was less sort of understanding of where the enemy was lurking. And I think in Iraq, it was fairly sort of straightforward. The mission was to defeat ISIS, whereas you went to Afghanistan and the US mission there at that particular point in time was to defeat ISIS-K, which is the Afghanistan branch of ISIS. But yet Taliban was presenting such a greater threat, and yet that wasn't the mission to go after the Taliban. And so that was very frustrating for Afghans because they're sort of looking at ISIS going, it's a sideshow, it's a joke. There's a couple of hundred, maybe 1,000 fighters, but Taliban are doing suicide bombings and, also wrecking all sorts of havoc pretty much all over the country every single day, and yet our mandate is not to go after them. So, I think that was sort of a very confusing mission all around at that point. And it really wasn't until later, I think Trump authorized the US and its partners to be able to go after Taliban, but that was very much late in the fight.
So just sort of make sure I got this right then. So after the kind of NATO troops stopped taking offensive action, I think it was 2015, there was almost like a pause on any kind of attacks on Taliban, and instead it was all about focusing on the ISIS-K.
Yes, so that was the mandate, because really ISIS-K, much like Al-Qaeda before it, was considered to be a threat to the US and to its interests, whereas the Taliban was really considered to be more of a domestic problem as opposed to a group that had any broader ideological desires. And so therefore it was never designated as an official terrorist group. And the Haqqani network, which operated sort of within the Taliban, was a designated terrorist group because at that point they were doing a lot of the kidnappings and extortion. But the Taliban as an umbrella itself was never a designated terrorist group.
I know a lot of veterans right now will be scratching their heads because we were told we weren't at war and they're not terrorists. So it's kind of like, if they're not terrorists and they weren't an army, who are we fighting?
Yeah, and that was part of the problem, and then you had new generals coming in every 3 to 4 years, and it was basically like starting over, and that is the big difference. The Taliban doesn't have new leaders coming in every few years and mandates changing and turnover and things like that. These are the same people that we see in power now were the same people in power 25 years ago. So they don't have that sort of same, they're in it for the long game. Whereas I think, with the way that our strategy works, which is sort of to continually change or evolve, that doesn't quite work in the Afghan model, in my opinion.
I mean, we had new brigadier every 6 months. So every 6 months in the British area in Helmand, it would be a new brigadier with a new plan. I mean, 6 months, you can't get anything done. It's just, no continuity. Do you agree from the Taliban that you've met? Would you say that their interests are within Afghanistan, or did you find them, they were saying, yeah, we're going to finish our job here and then we're going to come over to the States? Or were they like, no, we just want to control Afghanistan?
Yeah, I didn't meet sort of a single Talib that seemed to have any interest. And it was certainly a question I tried to ask as often as I could. And none of them expressed any interest in anything outside of Afghanistan. So I think they were very clear on their vision that they wanted Afghanistan to be independent of any foreign meddling or influence, and that their goal was to, create the Islamic Emirate that they wanted within that country. But I certainly didn't get any sense that there were any sort of great desires to extend beyond that border. I do think that the Taliban mandate is very much focused within the country itself, but that does beg the bigger question of, are they allowing, these groups like Al-Qaeda that have broader interests safe haven in the country, which is the reason that we went in there in the first place. So that is sort of the elephant in the room.
And that's also a really tough cookie, because if they kind of don't allow them, would that undermine their support? Like, would that pull a lot of people away from the Taliban and pull them into more hardline groups? So is it almost that they have to allow these kind of people in, because if they don't, they'll still be there anyway, and the Taliban will lose some of their quote unquote membership to them? Is that something that's like, is that plausible?
Yeah, I think it was certainly a big cause for concern. One of the things that, especially for, they couldn't seem like they are conceding to whatever demands the human rights community abroad has, or that the US has, because to them that would potentially take a huge chunk of their base, who will look at them and go, well, you're just doing what the US told you to do. This is exactly what you told us that you weren't going to do. So we're going to go and join ISIS-K now because you aren't living up to your mandate. So that is a very legitimate concern that the Talibs have. I also look, and history has a funny way of repeating itself, but I look back at the first rule that the Talibs had back in the 90s, and there was no more isolated government than the Taliban at that point in time. They were not recognized by anyone, certainly didn't have a seat at the UN. No real country, wanted to do any sort of business with them. And so it was obviously a difficult time for them financially. You have this one guy that comes in and gives you not much money, $1 million. In the scheme of things, that's not much. But when nobody's giving you anything, $1 million is a lot. And that man happened to be Osama bin Laden. So naturally, with their Pashtun-Wali code, and because he's the only person that's, giving them any support in the community, he's going to, have some sway in getting some safe haven. And so when 9/11 happened, and Bush said, sent the message to Mullah Omar, basically, give him up or we're coming in. That natural instinct was, well, he's the only one who supported us during this time. So why, you didn't. So why are we going to concede to what you tell us to do? And so, that led to the all-out invasion. Was it even conceivable that they could hand him over anyway? That I think is debatable, and it's hard. Because I hear a lot about, Mullah Omar and Osama supposedly having a close relationship. But a lot of also what I've come to understand and to read, and in talking with people that were close to Mullah Omar, I don't necessarily think that was the case. I think Mullah Omar tended to view Osama as more of a nuisance more than anything, in the sense of having this sort of powerful Al-Qaeda leader on his ground. In some ways that detracted from his own power, and also caused, issues with Pakistan, with the international community to some degree. So I do think it's conceivable that they had awareness of probably where he was at that point, which was probably Tora Bora. But whether or not, they had the closeness with him in order just to kind of hand him over, it's really hard to say. But I think the degree to which at that point that they had a close relationship has tended to be overplayed in the passage of time.
So this is where things derail for me, right? So it's right, hand over Osama, we're going to come and get him. Don't hand him over, come and get him. Osama goes into Pakistan. People know he's gone in Pakistan. We stay for 20 years. So with the kind of the Taliban that you've met and stuff, do they almost have like is there almost a bit of a, because one of the things you've probably experienced when you talk to a lot of soldiers is there's not really a lot of times a lot of animosity about each other about certain fights. You know what, it's like fair enough fight. It's almost kind of like I knew what I was getting into, he knew what he was getting into, no problem. Is there almost a bit of an almost acceptance that they know why we came over in the first place to get Osama, and then they're like, well, why are these people staying here now? Osama's gone, and then Osama's been dead for 10 years. Why are they still here? Is that kind of a kind of train of thought that you get with the Taliban that you met?
Yeah, you do. And I remember this one Talib who is actually the spokesperson now for the Virtue Vice Ministry that it puts out all these draconian rules. But he at that point, he was a sort of I think the correct term is culture minister for Logar province. And he was, similar age to me, kind of teenager when 9/11 happened and pretty much got into the fight straight away. And he sort of phrased it to me. I remember he looked at me and he said, well, how would you like it if I went to Australia and then suddenly started recruiting other Australians to join me in killing other Australians? Wouldn't you fight back? And of course, your instinct is certainly to say, well, of course I'd fight you back. And so that's sort of the way that he sees it is, well, that's what we were doing. We were fighting basically a foreign force that came to our country, started recruiting other countrymen to fight against us. And so we were doing what anybody would do, and that is continue to fight back until that influence was gone. So, there is that, perspective, which is a hard pill to swallow, I think, at times.
Is there a generational difference in the Afghanistan in terms of attitudes towards the West?
I would be inclined in my experience to kind of say not necessarily. I think even when you're talking to a lot of the young Talibs, it's not that they've necessarily had that much more of a exposed existence. A lot of the times they're poor villages. They went to these madrasas, in the tribal areas of Pakistan. They weren't necessarily, all that privy to smartphones and internet and all these things that we are. And so I think that, the majority of, they didn't get a, huge amount of schooling. And so their schooling is coming from these madrasas, and these very sort of extremist points of view. And so I think in some ways you could even look at the younger generation as potentially more extreme than even the older generation who have gone through multitudes of war and have probably got a little bit more wisdom under their belt about the way the world works. I think a lot of the younger Talibs are still very hardline, really, in their mindset. So I don't think it's all that. Their minds aren't necessarily broadened just because they're younger. And I think that is just a result of the way that most of them grew up.
So I suppose in a way there's a danger that we've kind of, by trying to take some terrorists off the board, that we've kind of hardened the, like what maybe, I mean, who knows if, I'm just, let's just say 9/11 never happened. So there was no need to go there. So we're not even talking about ignoring 9/11. We're saying, but they just never happened. What Afghanistan might look of like if there had been, 20 years, maybe would it still be the Taliban of 2001, or maybe there would things have gradually kind of changed there. But obviously, like, you can't have 20 years of war without hardening people, right? It's just not going to happen. We're talking about one of the hardest cultures on the planet in history anyway. Is history something that you find Afghans are very aware of?
I think, to obviously a large degree, Afghanistan has been in so many perpetual wars for so long. And so I think sadly, I think, it's become something that they pretty much accepted as part of their life. So again, it depends on, you can meet Afghans. There's sort of no one monolith of an Afghan. So you can meet Afghans that have had the fortune of being able to go to schools and to universities and to receive a much broader education. But I think what a lot of journalism fails to recognize is, you go out to the villages, which not enough journalists, in my opinion, do. I think so much is sort of focused in Kabul, which is very different than even, just traveling 40 minutes outside of the city, where their lives are potentially better as a result of the Taliban coming back to power. And I say that because they're no longer having to walk outside their home with the threat of a bombing or a firefight. It's not necessarily, you know, their village is not at war anymore, that it has been for so many decades. In terms of, you know, girls' education and things like that, they weren't things that were necessarily important to them to begin with. The women always covered themselves in a burqa anyway, and were very conservative in the way that they approached their lives. So their lives are very different to a lot of the women in the city. And so I think we sort of tend to kind of forget that so much of Afghanistan is still an extremely conservative place, and that their lives haven't necessarily changed all that much, the way that, you know, we tend to trumpet somewhere like Kabul. And that, you know, we could look at, you know, the war as well, and many places that you go to. You know, for example, I remember traveling to go to the original mosque in Kandahar that Mullah Omar started the Taliban out of. It's a very simple mosque. And, you know, I talked to the people there, and they didn't receive any benefit out of the US and NATO occupation there. And that was because that was sort of an area that was often very dangerous for troops and things to go to. So, you know, they couldn't really speak of the benefits that a lot of the people in Kabul perhaps received, because it was a lot easier to establish things there. So, you know, every Afghan is going to really come at it from a completely different personal experience.
Yeah, and the same is true of a lot of Brits that went to Helmand. I know a lot of people think, what was the fucking point? Because people go there 2006, they go 2009, there's really no difference. And I know friends who have been, and they said they'd gone to Kabul to do security work, like on the civilian sector, and then they were like, oh, that was when I realized that there was actually something changing. Because you go to Helmand, you go year after year after year, and like you said, there's nothing really changing there, and most of the people are just like, I just want my house to not be on a front line anymore. You know, which is obviously what most people think. Just think as well, as you're talking there, I was thinking, I think we really, so I definitely want to talk about the situation of people's kind of human rights and things there. And I just think when you mentioned just how long these people have been at war and stuff, it's very easy for us in the West to go like, you know, human rights is very important to me, or I don't want people to get whipped for doing this or that. But then you have to put it against that kind of backdrop of the violence, because the Taliban came to power because they ordered some kind of order and stability after brutal civil war, after decade of war with the Soviets, you know, millions of Afghans dead and displaced. And I think people are willing to accept some kind of harsh rule to have stability. I mean, it's almost like what happened in the West the last couple of years. People are like, all right, well, you can take away some of our freedoms, you know, in the name of safety, right? And I think maybe we underestimate that, just how many people are just like, look, okay, it's not what we want, but fuck, at least grandpa's not going to get blown apart by a bomb, and, you know, that kind of side of things. Is there a massive war weariness in the place, or, as you say, is it just something that, is it just so normal? And I mean, what are we talking here now? Like what? It's got to be 40 years of continuous war, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, 79 is when the war with the Soviets broke out, but, you know, even times before that, there was skirmishes and challenges, but 79 was really the beginning of the modern wars.
So do you find that the people that are, is there almost like a peace by any cost kind of mentality with it? Again, we're kind of generalizing here, but
I think it's hard to say. I'm sure there's certainly huge contingencies of people that feel that way, but they tend to be the less outspoken in the population. And we tend to really mostly only hear the voices of the desperate and people that are wanting to leave. And that really comes down to the economic situation that Afghanistan is in. And that is a byproduct of the US sort of building a country, based upon a war economy where 87% of people were either working for the US-backed government, or they were with an NGO, or they were with a contractor, or some degree. And so literally you pulled the plug on that overnight when the Taliban came to power. And so, I mean, there was no economy. It was a fake economy. And so naturally that is going to crumble. And then there's all sorts of concerns and sanctions and security worries about NGOs and other groups sort of staying there and operating. So that really it just was existed in a bubble for so long. And so when that bursts, naturally, that's going to be, have huge consequences. All those jobs are going to go away. All that financial assistance is going to go away. All that humanitarian aid is going to go away. And any country would certainly be struggling under that weight. And it happened all at once. So it was just a sort of an incredible slide.
Given that, I mean, I'm not good with numbers, but I can tell that 87% of people employed in that manner, when that ends, is going to be fucking disaster. Have you met anyone in, the kind of military hierarchy or defense experts? Have you met anyone that actually thought, yeah, the Afghan security forces will beat down the Taliban and this government in Kabul is going to last for decades?
I think, the Pentagon did a lot of talking on that, which... but I think, when you talk to soldiers, they're the first people that can tell you, that they weren't up to par. And I think also part of the problem is what we, and I say we as NATO people working in the country, what we tried to do was build a military based on Western militaries, based on, how the US approaches a conflict. And that was not an Afghan military. And so I think there was immediately, that disconnect there because it just wasn't necessarily inherent to the way they fight or the way that the fighting needed to have been done against the Taliban. And I think, for so long, and this goes back to my theory about the roots of corruption. To me, corruption was the number one thing that led to the Taliban coming back to power. It was the number one thing why Afghanistan really, in the end of the day, failed. And the US and other countries were very well aware of the corruption. You can go back to cigar reports back to 2011, where they're saying, all this stuff is happening. There is money that's not supposed to be going where it's going. And at the end of the day, that was reflected in the military. So the US might look at a piece of paper that says we have 300,000 soldiers and they're stationed here, here, and here with this capacity. But what was failed, I guess, to really be recognized was that a huge portion of that 300,000 were ghost soldiers, which meant that they didn't exist. They'd either died on the battlefield and their commanders were continuing to use their cards to go and withdraw their pay every month. Or they, in order to get the money, that half the equipment in that battalion had been sold or siphoned off or, wasn't working anymore and nobody wanted to kind of report it. So there was corruption on so many levels. And I really think that at the end of the day, that's what led to the downfall, because what the figures we were seeing on paper didn't match the reality. And so the capability that the US and other people thought that the Afghan forces had just didn't exist. And so that really made it easy for the Taliban to be able to, again, play into that corruption in terms of cutting deals with warlords, cutting deals with commanders, and really bring in a huge force because the numbers just weren't there when push came to shove.
Was that naivety from the West or worse?
Yes, definitely naivety had to have played a part in it, but I think there was just always this unwillingness to ever deal with corruption. And you can go back to, I remember reading leaked State Department cables from 10, 12 years ago, and they were talking about corruption then, and yet it was sort of looked at as this systematic problem that the US can't really solve, or it was a secondary problem to everything else. Rather than looking at it as a real root cause of everything that was going on in Afghanistan and the reason why things were failing. And when I really started to explore this, it blew my mind just how deep that corruption really went. And that, you would have judges in places that would, host these sort of fake trials, or somebody would be falsely accused of a crime just so that a fake trial could be held that could then enable a judge or other, prosecutors to extort money out of people. And it just, on every level, there seemed to be a way that corruption had sort of been able to be sort of figured out by everyone on every possible level. And so, again, the Taliban also used that as a key recruitment tool. So even if you don't perhaps agree ideologically with the Taliban, if you are, just a poor Afghan farmer and you're trying to get to work every day and you're having to pay off a policeman every single day because, he's only going to let you through that checkpoint if you do, eventually you're going to get pissed off enough that you're going to want to fight against your own government. And whether you agree with the Taliban or not, they're the ones that were doing the heavy lifting when it came to that. And so I also think that was just a real failure to kind of recognize the role that corruption was playing. And it was something that made me incredibly angry when I was there. Because you would just see, these people would come at me desperate for whatever hand that they could get in terms of getting out of the country. And I would look down and look at their Rolex and say, well, if that money that you received to buy that Rolex had actually gone to where it was supposed to go to, maybe you wouldn't be in this situation right now. And that was a big problem that still now, I think a lot of people don't want to recognize is the level. And you can blame the US, you can blame other people for, flooding the country with this sort of money that they'd never seen before that enabled this corruption. And once one person started, everybody kind of had to be in on it. But at the same time, to me, that is really what led to the downfall. And I see that in Afghanistan. I saw it in Iraq. I see it in so many places. And it's frustrating because yet it just seems so little. There's no ever accountability. When was the last time you heard about, and the US, had soldiers and other people that were certainly part of different corruption schemes too. But really, when was the last time you ever heard about an Afghan government official being held accountable for stealing X amount of dollars? It just didn't happen. And so when you can get away with it, it's only going to increase. And it got to the point where I think it was mind blowing to me.
Well, it's like right now we're holding back money, saying, well, we can't give this money to the Taliban, even though there's this famine going on in Afghanistan. I'm thinking, well, why wasn't this kind of like, if we're saying that we can't give it to them because some of it's going to get siphoned off, as you're saying, it's been siphoned off for 2 decades. That doesn't seem like a good excuse to let fucking kids starve to me.
No.
And I just want to, before we kind of talk about that, I just want to, because I really think that you need to, it used to be that old maxim of know thy enemy, which seems to have gone out the window now, and people don't seem to want to understand the Taliban or what the motivations are, just kind of have this only good Taliban's a dead Taliban, thing, which is, it's just such a ridiculously simplistic view of looking at things, because it's like, look, at the end of the day, they're controlling large parts of the country, now control all of the country, and if we want to make life better for the Afghan people, which I think most of us do, then you have to know who the people on the other side are. But so people don't think that we are kind of cheerleading the Taliban, let's just say, what are some of the things that have really kind of deteriorated in Afghanistan since they've come back over the last year? Well,
certainly press freedom, that is a big one. And again, that was something that was so bizarre in the beginning, because after the fall, I remember it just suddenly, the Taliban didn't really understand how to govern. I think they'd come to power much quicker than they'd expected. They were also very much on a PR tirade of making them seem, wanting the world to sort of think that they'd changed and were very different to their previous rule. So suddenly everything was incredibly open. You sort of just had to go and get a letter from Mujahid, the spokesman, giving you sort of permission to operate there, and you basically wave this letter through any checkpoint or any place, and they don't bother you. So for the first few weeks, it was really incredible. You'd go up to a ministry, and me as a woman, I wouldn't even be security checked, and I'm like walking through the MOD. I remember at one point going up to a suicide bombing school that was it was hidden in a kindergarten, and I'd sort of got wind that it existed. And so we thought let's try and see what's going on here. So I was with my fixer and my photographer, Jake, and we just basically went up and knocked on the door and told them we were journalists and wanted to come and talk to them. And they said, okay, you're Australian, you're all right then, clearly as long as I wasn't American. And they let us in. And so here we are touring the suicide school. It was just, it was very bizarrely opened. But that really didn't take too long for that to change. And so I think, very quickly things started to become a lot harder to get interviews. It was a lot harder to get access. The Taliban were very weary of any journalist being there. And basically it was easier just to ignore you rather than, try to present their point of view, which I think they tried to do at the beginning. So, and I think that has only really deteriorated over time, is that sense of press freedom that I think that is probably one of the most flagrant things that have deteriorated, and then on top of that, obviously we talk about women, we talk about access to girls' education. which is a huge problem. And, it's been more than a year now since girls have been able to go to school in most provinces. And it's just sort of one excuse after another that the Taliban seems to not be able to agree upon in things. And yet they'll sort of wax lyrical and tell you, oh, but we believe in full rights to girls under Islam. So obviously the plight of women and girls' education in Afghanistan is a really big problem when most of the country is not able to go to school, and it's been more than a year. But this is a problem that is very unique to Afghanistan. So, there are many Muslim majority countries in the world, but yet Afghanistan is the only one that seems to not be allowing girls to go to school. And I think that has more to do with sort of the very conservative Pashtun culture as opposed to, anything religious. But we keep hearing the same excuses from them for the past year, which is, we believe in girls' education and full rights. And yet, we've got to fix the uniform issue, or we have to make sure there's separate transportation for the girls and they have to be in a separate school. And most of these mechanisms are already in place. So it just seems to be one excuse after the other. And that is a really big problem. And I also think it points to the very fragmented nature of the Taliban, because the Taliban isn't one cohesive unit. There are many different interests within the Taliban. And so I think a lot of that sort of very archaic rule comes from the Kandahari side of the Taliban, which are very much about their Pashtun culture and these sort of very draconian laws. But then I look at, other aspects of the Taliban, for example, the Haqqani network. And a lot of them, their daughters, their sisters, their wives are often educated in Arab schools and universities. And so they tend to have a little bit of a different outlook, I think, on education. And so it sort of just points to this jostle within the Taliban that they're not able to solve. And I also have spoken to Taliban members and leaders and spokespeople who will tell me, you should continue to push them on this. This is a problem. So there are people within the Taliban that certainly are advocates of not agreeing with that policy. So, but it is a big problem. And I think the Taliban really needs to realize that they aren't going to get anywhere in terms of having large-scale diplomatic relations, particularly with the West, if they don't sort of allow this very basic right. It's interesting to me because it's obviously extremely important, but so many horrible things can happen to people in terms of, how they're treated or stoning, if accused of adultery. And that happens in many countries. And yet it's the girls' education, which, don't get me wrong, again, very important, but that seems to be sort of the stickler for the lens that the international community views Afghanistan out of.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's you've only got to look at what goes on in places like Saudi Arabia to think like, could we actually have a lot of influence over these people? Could we not be? And then I suppose, again, this would be a whole other conversation, but it's like, who actually has the influence over who when you can't clamp down on things like that?
Yeah.
What is the biggest obstacle that Afghanistan has now?
I really think it's right now, it's certainly, it's in the economic humanitarian front. When you can't feed your family, when you can't find a job, when you can't sort of have basic medical needs met, that is a big obstacle that, that needs to be overcome. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem, but it's really about trying to build up some kind of real infrastructure in Afghanistan. $2.2 trillion couldn't do it. So, what is going to be able to do it? And that is going to be the problem that Afghanistan and only Afghanistan can really address. I think the more that, outside influence tries to sort of come in and save the day or to kind of impose their way of doing things, that's just not going to work for Afghanistan. And so really now it is up to the Afghan people, up to the Taliban, up to, whoever's really controlling different villages and places to make an effort and show a willingness to put that infrastructure in place. And Afghanistan has to be in charge of Afghanistan. It doesn't work when the outside is trying to do it for them.
We haven't even scratched the surface of your experiences in Afghanistan, all the people that you've talked to and everything. I've had a nice day reading through the stuff on your Substack. So I recommend everyone go and take a look at that. But for people who don't know what Substack is and why it's important, can you tell people a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I obviously I worked for Fox for many years for most of my sort of professional career, and in the beginning of 2020 for a multitude of different reasons, it was no longer sort of the work that I wanted to be doing. I think, to be quite frank, unfortunately, had sort of gone down this sort of avenue of clickbait journalism, if in my opinion, where everything had become about a sort of a factory, and there was an unwillingness, at least in the department that I was in, to put the money and put the time into really doing in-depth reporting, to going to these places, to even investigating stories on a domestic level. It was all just about sort of copying and pasting, and in my opinion, that model, which is sort of they call it the aggregation model, but to me that's it's still reverse plagiarism, and that wasn't something that I wanted to engage in at all. So I decided that that was not a fit for me, and I really wanted that independence to be able to go and live in Afghanistan again, to be able to sort of travel fairly freely and spend as long as I felt necessary in a certain place to cover that story and to really do these stories justice. So that's when I sort of made that leap to go independent, which is very scary, to kind of lose that backing and and the name and the access and all the good things that come with that. But I, in my early sort of phase of sort of starting to freelance and reaching out to different places and sort of building my own sort of content, Substack was something that I started at the beginning of last year because I felt a lot of great journalists, Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone and Glenn Greenwald, who founded The Intercept, and a lot of really great journalists had gone down that model because I think it's a way you can do independent journalism. So it's sort of like a Patreon in the sense that you subscribe to the different writers or different topics that you're interested in. And each sort of individual Substack has a different sort of pay model. My content is free. If you choose to, contribute, that's awesome. Thank you. But I still believe in getting the story out there without the sort of paywalls that we see everywhere. So most of my content is free, and you can just sort of send out. It's up to you. And for me, I usually send out 1 to 2 newsletters a week, and that really feature an in-depth story from a different part of the world. And I try to tell it in that long form journalism that I always wanted to do. That was sort of losing steam in the mainstream media. And I really try to tell it from a personal lens. And so Substack for me was just sort of a great fit to be able to sort of tell the stories the way that I wanted to tell them without, being told it had to go down a certain agenda, or even I wanted to be able to give stories a personal touch too, and not sort of write in a formulaic news writing style. And so I have full control in being able to do that with Substack. And so I think it's a great platform for independent journalism, and I think it's a great way for journalists to be able to make a little bit of extra money to continue to do the work, and for people to also get content that they can't find anywhere else, or that's sort of unique to their interests.
Yeah, and I would just like to say, if people are complaining about the mainstream media and don't support independent journalists, then shut the fuck up. You can't complain about it if you're not supporting it. And I include myself in that. I've just kind of like understanding these things a bit more now. But it's actually great. It's a great cause for optimism, because there are a lot of journalists, yourself included, who are getting out there and getting these stories. So the stories are out there, the journalists are out there. So go and support them. And you have a book coming out.
Yeah. So originally that was sort of the reason I even went to Afghanistan. And this was before the fall last year. So my photographer, Jake Simkin, who is also Australian, he'd lived in Afghanistan previously, and like me, just sort of had a deep love for it, wanted to go back. It's that place, and this is going to be really politically incorrect of me to say, but I remember Jake used to call it's sort of like an abusive partner. It's like you love it, you hate it, but you keep going back. And so that's sort of what we used to refer to Afghanistan as. So we decided collectively that, let's go back and let's do a coffee table book. And I thought that would be really unique because he's such a brilliant photographer. And then at the same time, I would do the writing for it. And it would just be a different medium for people to be able to understand Afghanistan. And so we really thought we'd be going back to document that last phase of the US and allied troops being there, And then it was going to be, well, how is the Afghan government going to stand on its own 2 feet? So that was our prerogative in going back. And yeah, we didn't expect it to end so quickly and to sort of go the direction it did. So the book has sort of ended up being, life before the fall, life during the fall. We were both caught in Mazar Sharif in the north as it fell to the Taliban just before it fell in Kabul. And then the months that ensued of, suddenly the whole country was opened up to us. And so all the places we couldn't go to, we could now drive to. We could get in the car and do these, crazy road trips from Kabul to Kandahar, or, we entered again back right from the Uzbek border and back down to Kabul. And I think we pretty much went to every province. And that was super strange because it was never doable for security reasons before. And so we were able to really, I think, capture a lot of the country that a lot of people just don't understand and don't see and don't, we think of Afghanistan as war, but really forget that it's such a beautiful place. As I'm sure, Bamiyan, that's where the Buddhas were that the Talibs blew up in 2001. But that really is, to me, one of the most incredibly visually amazing places on the planet. And so we wanted to be able to bring that to people in kind of a different way. And so I thought, a coffee table book is really a great way to do that. It's not a heavy lift. It's something people can sit and read in an afternoon and sort of be taken on a visual journey in that process. So I'm excited for that to come out.
I just want to add about your Substack as well to people. Is there was obviously a lot of coverage about Afghanistan in August, but your stuff is September, October, November, December of that year. There's loads of stories from that period, which is a very let's just say an abandoned period by most media. So that I think I found that really interesting to be that you were in there in that kind of immediate that aftermath. Hollie, I could go on and talk about this stuff all day, and I'd love to have you back on the podcast anytime you want to come on, and I'll try and pull you on at some point.
I'd love to.
Look, these are my questions. We've got through about 4 of them, so we'll have to have you back. So, but we've talked about a lot of stuff today, and some people might feel that there's obviously Afghanistan's got big challenges ahead of it. Absolutely, no one's going to deny that. But what is a case for optimism, or something that you bring yourself back to you've got a smile on your face, you keep going back to these places. What is it that, like, something that you kind of like look forward to, something that kind of puts a smile on your face when you think about the future of these kind of, not even necessarily Afghanistan, but just the future of humanity even in general?
I mean, I think Afghans, and, can apply this to a lot of the places I've worked in the Middle East as well, Yemen, Iraq, Syria. There is just this incredible hospitality that comes, and there's an incredible, very beautiful sort of value on family that I think, so much of us in the West have lost. And their lives revolve around, ensuring that they have their meals together, and in such tenacity in their faith, and how important that is to a lot of people, and welcoming guests. And, they may be, being in sort of refugee camps where they absolutely have nothing, but they will give you whatever they have. And I see this sort of time and time again in war zones. And so whilst you do really see the worst of humanity, you also just see the best. And you go there and you remember how important the simple things are in life. And I think, here people get so caught up, especially, for me, living in LA, New York, DC, it's sort of, you're surrounded by people that are constantly sort of climbing over one another to get somewhere, or it's sort of looking over your shoulder for the next best thing, and everything is smoke and mirrors. You open Instagram, it's all smoke and mirrors of people sort of, telling you what they eat all day and showing, off their abs or whatever it is. And you go to a place like Afghanistan where, every single person is a victim of war. Every single person knows somebody who has had their legs blown off, or have lost their children, or, have endured something that, luckily most of us will never have to imagine. And yet, they're still resilient. They're still living through it. They're still welcoming to foreigners. And there's just such a beautiful simplicity and minimalism about their life that I hope that in some way that I can translate back.
Hollie, that was just a great way to end the episode. Thank you so much for coming on today, and yeah, we would love to have you back soon. And listeners, we'll catch you next time, and we love you. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me.
Sold a dream to all of us, a dream that we'd all die for, a reason for us all to live and something we could fight for. I might just help a man up to his feet or hold a newborn, but no matter what I do, my hands remembering my rifle.